The funny thing about theft is that sometimes the thieves send you invoices. I was standing barefoot on the warped cedar dock of Blackwater Key when I said that out loud to nobody, staring at 26 half-finished cabins rising through the pines like a fever dream I hadn't authorized. Hammers rang over the water. A generator coughed and rattled near the shore. Men in orange vests moved lumber from barge to beach as if they had every right in the world to be there. And according to the Homeowners Association of Pelican Bay Estates, they did. My island, they said, had been designated for community expansion amenities under a revised development map. Their contractors were simply executing approved plans. Their lawyer had even mailed me a polite notice reminding me not to interfere with construction on property, subject to association governance. That was the moment I understood this was no misunderstanding. It was a takeover dressed up in stationery and procedure. 3 months earlier, I had still believed this could be solved with one phone call. I'm not a dramatic man by nature. I'm 48, a marine surveyor by trade, and I inherited Blackwater Key from my grandfather, Elias Mercer, who bought it in 1974 when nobody wanted a mangrove-choked spit of land 3 miles off the coast. He built one weatherproof house on the high ridge, a dock on the western side, and spent the rest of his life refusing offers from developers who saw waterfront property the way wolves see a fence line. When he died, the island came to me with old maps, old stories, and one iron rule he repeated so often it became family scripture. Keep your papers better than your promises, because promises disappear the minute money shows up. At first, Pelican Bay Estates was just another glossy development creeping along the mainland shoreline opposite my island. They cleared scrub, paved roads with names like Heron Loop and Whispering Palms Drive, and sold retirees a version of coastal peace that came with deed restrictions, painted mailboxes, and a board of extremely motivated people who loved the word community as long as it meant control. I had no interest in them, and for a while they had no interest in me. Blackwater Key sat outside their gates, outside their roads, outside their worldview. My property taxes went to the county. My utilities were my own problem. My dock permits were filed directly with the state. I figured that was enough distance to keep everybody honest. Then the letters started. The first one arrived in February, forwarded from my mainland post office box. It welcomed me to the Pelican Bay Estates Homeowners Association and included a cheerful packet explaining dues, architectural standards, dock use rules, and penalties for noncompliance. I thought it was absurd, then mildly amusing. I called the number listed at the bottom of the letter and got a woman named Denise, who sounded like she smiled whenever she denied something. There must be some mistake, I told her. I don't live in Pelican Bay Estates. There was a pause, keyboard clicking, then a tone I've come to recognize in bureaucrats right before they say something outrageous with complete confidence. Mr. Mercer, according to our revised plat integration filed with the county planning office, Blackwater Key falls within the community master boundary. No, I said. It absolutely does not. Well, she replied, bright as polished glass. Our records indicate otherwise. That phrase became the anthem of the next several weeks. Their records indicate otherwise. Their board voted otherwise. Their planning consultant interpreted otherwise. Every time I produced a tax parcel number, a survey, a prior deed, they responded with a new packet, a new map, a new procedural layer designed to exhaust me. Then came a certified envelope with an invoice for $12,400 in unpaid HOA assessments, retroactive. Another for dock code violations. Another for unauthorized exterior paint on a structure they had never owned, governed, visited, or built. I drove to the county records office myself, a squat tin building with flickering lights, and a clerk named Marisol who had known my grandfather. She pulled up the filing history and frowned the deeper she looked. Pelican Bay's developer had submitted an amended master plan 6 months earlier. Buried in 73 pages of exhibits was a map shading my island the same pale green as their common-use recreational parcels. No deed transfer, no signature from me, no judicial order, just color on paper, filed with enough confidence that everyone downstream had started treating fiction like law. Marisol leaned back and tapped the screen. This shouldn't have passed review. But it did. She gave me the kind of look government workers save for disasters too stupid to describe. That happens more than people think. I should have fought immediately, loudly, publicly. Instead, I made the mistake that people like the Pelican Bay board count on. I believed truth would slow them down. I sent formal objections. I hired a land use attorney. I documented everything. And while I was doing that, while I was being careful and correct and civilized, they hired barges, hauled in pilings, and started building 26 cabins on my private island as if ownership were just a detail they could tidy up later. If you've never watched strangers improve your property for their own benefit, let me save you the experience. It produces a very specific kind of anger, one that starts hot and theatrical, then hardens into something quieter and more useful. By the second week of construction, I stopped fantasizing about storming onto the shoreline and started taking photographs with timestamps, drone footage, barge registration numbers, and close-ups of every permit decal I could find. I knew outrage wouldn't win this. Records might. My attorney, Daniel Kessler, was the kind of man who looked perpetually disappointed in furniture. He had a narrow face, rimless glasses, and a voice so calm it made bad news sound organized. We met in his office over a stack of plats, survey overlays, and county filings spread across a conference table. "They're betting on momentum," he said, tapping the amended map with one finger. "If they build enough, spend enough, and sell the narrative that this was all a good-faith error, a court may hesitate to issue immediate demolition. Judges don't like waste. So the plan is to steal my island efficiently," I said. "The plan," he replied, "is to create facts on the ground before anyone forces a legal answer." He filed for injunctive relief within 48 hours. We included the original 1974 deed, tax records, state survey documents, dock permits, aerials, probate transfer documents after my grandfather's death, and an affidavit from Marisol at the records office describing the filing irregularities. It should have been straightforward. Instead, the HOA's attorney responded with a 40-page opposition full of polished nonsense. They argued that Blackwater Key had long been functionally integrated into the broader Pelican Bay development concept. They cited obsolete planning language, referenced access easements that did not exist, and attached architectural renderings of my island labeled Community Isi Retreat Village as if aspiration were evidence. At the preliminary hearing, their lawyer actually used the phrase shared coastal stewardship. That's how these people talk when they want your land, while sounding enlightened. The judge set a full evidentiary hearing for the following month and declined to halt work immediately, citing disputes of fact and the need for a more complete record. I still remember the sensation in my chest when Kessler told me. It wasn't shock. Shock is sharp. This was denser than that. It felt like swallowing a stone. "Can they just keep building?" I asked. "For now," he said. "But every nail they drive increases their exposure if we win." That was legally true and emotionally useless. So I went back to Blackwater Key and watched them build a small village where my grandfather used to cast for snook at dusk. They worked 6 days a week. Framing crews arrived at sunrise on barges loaded with trusses, concrete board, rolled roofing, windows still wrapped in branded plastic. Someone had staked walking paths between the cabins. Someone else had spray-painted utility routes across the sandy rise near my house. One afternoon, I found 2 men measuring the slope behind my rainwater cistern. I walked over and asked what they were doing. "Laying out for the bathhouse," one of them said without looking up. "The what?" He straightened, squinted at me, then checked a clipboard. "Bathhouse. Central amenity. You with the inspection team?" I laughed then, but there wasn't anything funny in it. "No," I said. "I'm the owner." That got his attention. The second worker lowered his tape measure slowly. The first one studied my face as if comparing me to a rumor. Finally, he shrugged in the weary way working men do when management has lied to them and they're too underpaid to be surprised. "They told us this was association land," he said. "I know they did." He looked back at the cabin frames, then at my house up on the ridge. "You should talk to the site supervisor." "I've talked to everyone." The supervisor, a barrel-chested man named Vince with mirrored sunglasses and a permanent sunburn, treated me with the casual impatience reserved for people he assumed lacked leverage. He kept one boot on an overturned bucket while I spoke, never fully facing me. "Look," he said, "I'm not the deed guy. I build what I'm contracted to build. The paperwork came through. County didn't stop it. Association paid deposits. We're on schedule. You're trespassing." He smiled thinly. "Then your lawyer can tell their lawyer." It was infuriating not because he was wrong, but because he understood exactly how this game worked. Everyone hid one layer behind someone else. The board blamed the planner. The planner blamed the filings. The county blamed limited review scope. The contractors blamed approved paperwork. By the time responsibility completed its circle, my island had 6 finished roofs, 9 wrapped shell structures, and stacks of cedar siding waiting under tarps. Then the homeowners started arriving by boat. At first, it was just a few curious residents from Pelican Bay, drifting near the shore with drinks in hand, pointing at the cabins like they were touring a resort before opening day. One woman in a giant straw hat called across the water, "Is this where the yoga deck's going?" A man beside her shouted back, "Board says there'll be kayak storage too." I stood on my dock and stared at them. "You're on private property," I yelled. The woman blinked, then gave me a pitying smile. "No, honey," she said, "this is part of Phase 3. There is a particular insult in being corrected about your own property by a woman balancing white wine in a stainless steel tumbler." She said it gently, too, with the patient confidence of someone repeating a fact to a child. "This is part of Phase 3. As if my grandfather's island, the one he fought mosquitoes and hurricanes and bankruptcy scares to keep, had become a bullet point in a board presentation. The boat drifted off after that, but the sentence stayed with me. It wasn't just that they believed the lie. It was that the lie had become social truth. In their world, if enough people in matching polo shirts repeated something at a quarterly meeting, then ownership itself could be voted into existence. That weekend, Pelican Bay held a shoreline mixer on the mainland marina lawn. I know this because one of the residents posted the invitation publicly on a neighborhood page, complete with a watercolor rendering of my island at sunset. The caption read, "Celebrate the future of our private ECO retreat." I stared at that image for a long time. Someone had added lanterns along the beach and a communal fire pit where my grandfather used to mend nets. They had edited my life into an amenity package. Kessler told me not to go. "You'll be angry," he said. "Angry people make useful clips for the other side." He was right, which is why I went anyway. I wore jeans, a plain button-down shirt, and the expression of a man attending his own misunderstanding. The marina lawn was crowded with folding tables, catered shrimp, little signs describing the association's vision for sustainable island recreation, and residents who had paid good money to live inside the Pelican Bay dream. At the center of it all stood the HOA board, President Alan Dorsey, Vice President Linda Keene, Treasurer Scott Vance, and Secretary Denise, the same Denise from the phone call, smiling in person exactly the way I'd imagined. They stood beneath a poster board showing a phased site plan of Blackwater Key, cabin cluster A through D, bathhouse, kayak cove, meditation deck, birdwatch tower. A birdwatch tower. For a moment, I felt detached from my own body, as if I were observing a stranger's legal nightmare from somewhere a few feet above my shoulders. Then Alan Dorsey stepped up to a microphone and welcomed everyone to what he called the next chapter in Pelican Bay's shared coastal legacy. Applause. He clicked through renderings while talking about community value, heritage preservation, and low-impact access. Every sentence was polished. Every lie had passed through enough committees to sound civic-minded. He thanked the developer's planning team. He thanked the county for its collaborative responsiveness. He thanked residents for supporting a visionary amenity with multi-generational potential. Then he invited questions. I don't remember deciding to move. One second I was near the back by the iced tea station, and the next I was walking through rows of white rental chairs toward the microphone. People turned. A few recognized me from prior confrontations at the marina. Denise saw me first. Her smile faltered, then recovered into something ceremonial. "Good evening," Alan said, in the careful tone people use when they suspect a scene. "Can we help you?" "Yes," I said. "You can explain why you're building 26 cabins on my island." The silence that followed was not total, but it was close enough to feel expensive. Alan folded his hands. "Sir, ownership boundaries are currently under legal review." "No," I said. "My ownership is not under legal review. Your attempt to blur it is." A murmur moved through the crowd. Linda Keene stepped closer to the microphone stand. "We understand emotions are high," she said. "But this matter involves historical integration documents and county-recognized planning jurisdiction." There it was again, language designed to make theft sound administrative. I looked out at the residents. Some seemed confused. Some looked irritated, as though I were ruining a cruise presentation. A few looked genuinely alarmed. Good. Let them be. My grandfather bought Blackwater Key in 1974, I said, raising my voice so the people in back could hear. We have the original deed, surveys, tax records, probate transfers, and state permits. This board filed a colored map with the county and acted like that changed title. It didn't. Scott Vance, the treasurer, leaned into the side microphone. That is a gross oversimplification. Then simplify this, I said. Did I ever sign anything conveying my island to Pelican Bay? Nobody answered. Did a court order transfer title? Still nothing. Did the county ever record a deed out of my name? A woman in the audience turned to her husband. I heard her whisper, "Can they do that?" Alan raised both hands in a calming gesture. The association has relied in good faith on professional filings and planning approvals. Good faith. That phrase almost impressed me with its audacity. They had turned trespass into a branding strategy. I stepped back from the microphone before my temper outran my usefulness. As I walked away, I heard someone ask Alan whether construction would continue. He hesitated just long enough for everybody to notice. And for the first time since this started, I realized something important. They were not afraid of me being angry. They were afraid of their own residents learning they had built an entire dream on land they did not own. The first crack in Pelican Bay's polished facade didn't come from the court. It came from a Facebook comment posted by a retired orthodontist named Nancy Heller at 10:14 p.m. the night of the Shoreline Mixer. Under the HOA's glossy event photos, she wrote, "Wait, are we absolutely sure the island is legally ours?" By breakfast the next morning, 27 people had liked the comment, 8 had replied, and somebody had already screenshotted my outburst at the microphone from a shaky phone video. By lunch, the residents' page had split into factions. One side insisted the board had done its due diligence, and I was a bitter obstructionist trying to shake down the community. The other side began asking basic questions no one on the board seemed prepared to answer, such as how exactly an island became association property without a purchase, a signature, or a deed. That was the week Pelican Bay stopped feeling invincible. Kessler called me after reading through a batch of resident posts and forwarded emails that one sympathetic homeowner had quietly sent him. "Do not engage online," he said before I could speak. "Let them unravel themselves." I wasn't planning to post. Good, because this is better than posting. Their residents are discovering the difference between a site plan and ownership. He was right. The board had spent months controlling the story in closed meetings, newsletters, and official updates. But panic is harder to manage once it becomes participatory. Homeowners wanted to know whether their dues had funded unauthorized construction. Prospective buyers wanted to know whether the advertised eco-retreat was real. A man who had apparently reserved one of the future cabins for a family reunion wanted to know whether his deposit was refundable. Someone else demanded to see the governing documents proving Blackwater Key had ever been annexed into the HOA. The board responded with the bureaucratic equivalent of smoke, references to pending review, legal complexity, consultant reliance, and confidence in process. The more they avoided direct answers, the more frightened people became. Then a subcontractor filed a mechanic's lien. That detail might sound technical, but it changed the temperature of everything. One of the framing subcontractors had not been paid on time and recorded a lien notice against the property where the work was performed, my property, with my parcel number, my legal description, and my name in the chain of title section. Kessler received a copy 2 days later and drove it to my house himself. He set it on the kitchen table like it was evidence from a murder. "Well," I said after reading it twice, "that's awkward for them." "It's better than awkward," he said. "It's useful. Because unlike the board's carefully massaged language, lien filings require specificity. Somebody, somewhere in the contractor payment chain, had finally used the real legal description for Blackwater Key. Not Pelican Bay Phase 3. Not Community Eco-Retreat Village. Blackwater Key, Parcel 17-04-22-1180, title vested in Mercer, Daniel Elias. My full legal name. Their own construction machine had accidentally acknowledged my ownership more clearly than any county planning summary ever had. Kessler's smile was thin and predatory. "I'm subpoenaing every contract, every invoice, every change order, every internal email referencing this parcel." The evidentiary hearing was still 2 weeks away, but now the pressure shifted. Contractors don't enjoy discovering they've built on disputed land. Insurers enjoy it even less. Within days, 2 suppliers paused deliveries pending clarification of title. The barge company demanded written indemnification before making another run. A portable sanitation vendor removed 3 units from the island overnight, apparently unconvinced by Pelican Bay's version of events. Construction didn't stop completely, but it began to stutter. Work crews arrived late. Material piles got smaller. Vince, the site's supervisor with the mirrored sunglasses, suddenly became much more interested in avoiding me. I found him near the shoreline one morning, staring at his phone beside stacks of wrapped siding. He looked up when he heard my boots on the sand. "You here to tell me I'm trespassing again?" he asked. "I assumed you'd memorized it by now." He rubbed the back of his neck. Without the swagger, he looked less like a foreman and more like a man calculating how far trouble could spread uphill. "We got a notice from one of the suppliers," he said. "They're saying title's clouded." "It isn't clouded," I said. "It's mine." He exhaled through his nose. "Yeah, I'm beginning to gather that." That may have been the first honest sentence anyone connected to the project had spoken to me. Later that afternoon, Marisol from the records office called with another surprise. She had been reviewing the amended filing history again and found an attachment discrepancy in the county's digital archive. One exhibit referenced owner consent forms for parcels affected by the revised master boundary. The forms themselves were missing. "Missing as in misplaced?" I asked. "Missing as in referenced but not present," she said. "And nobody can tell me why." Kessler's response was immediate and grimly pleased. "If they claimed consent forms existed, I want to know who said so, when, and based on what." That was when the shape of the thing changed in my mind. Until then, I had treated Pelican Bay as arrogant, reckless, and entitled. But missing consent forms suggested something more dangerous than incompetence. It suggested that somewhere between the developer, the board, and the county paperwork pipeline, someone had expected ownership objections to be solved by paperwork that either never existed or was never supposed to be examined too closely. And if that was true, court was no longer just about stopping construction. It was about forcing people to say under oath exactly how they thought they were going to get away with it. There's a moment before a storm when the air feels organized, as if the world is holding its breath in neat rows. The week before the evidentiary hearing felt like that. Pelican Bay was still functioning on the surface. Gates opening, sprinklers hissing, golf carts drifting past decorative palms. But underneath, everything had begun to tighten. Residents were whispering in driveways. Contractors were reviewing indemnity clauses they should have read more carefully the first time. And somewhere behind closed doors, the board was scrambling to convert panic into strategy. Kessler and I spent 3 long evenings preparing for court in his office over legal pads, binders, and a laptop full of scanned records. If there is romance in litigation, I've never seen it. What I saw was fluorescent light, cold coffee, and a man in rimless glasses building a trap one authenticated exhibit at a time. He organized everything chronologically. The 1974 deed from the original seller to my grandfather. The county tax records showing uninterrupted assessment to the Mercer family. The probate transfer after Elias died. The state dock permits. The GIS parcel maps. The HOA letters. The retroactive dues invoices. The amended master plan. The mechanics lien using my legal description. The site photos showing 26 active cabin structures and utility markings around my cistern. Truth is not self-executing, Kessler said, sliding tabs into a binder. You have to make it legible. He had also obtained early subpoena returns from the contractor side, and those were almost better than anything we already had. One internal email from the project administrator asked whether Mercer consent docs had been uploaded to the county package. Another reply said, not in my set, but planning said legal had title alignment handled. A third, sent weeks later after construction started, read, if owner pushes, board wants us to stay on schedule and let council resolve. That phrase sat in my mind like a fishhook. If owner pushes. Not if ownership is disputed. Not if annexation is pending. If owner pushes. They knew there was an owner, and they kept building anyway. The board's deposition excerpts were worse for them than I expected. Alan Dorsey, under oath, described relying on the developer's planning consultants and admitted he had never personally reviewed a recorded deed showing transfer of Blackwater Key into HOA control. Denise said she believed owner consent would have been included in the county file, but could not identify ever seeing such a document. Scott Vance testified that construction was approved because timing considerations made delay undesirable once contractor commitments were in place. In ordinary language, that meant they moved ahead because stopping would be inconvenient. Then came the county planner's statement. He was careful, almost painfully so. He testified that his office reviewed amended master submissions for planning conformity, not final adjudication of title disputes, and that parcel shading on a planning exhibit should not be construed independently as proof of ownership. Kessler read that line aloud 3 times, smiling more each time. Pelican Bay had built an entire legal fantasy on a category error, treating planning inclusion as title transfer because it was useful, because it was expedient, and because too many people downstream assumed someone upstream had checked. The night before the hearing, I stayed alone on Blackwater Key. The crews had mostly stopped by then. Wind moved through the unfinished cabin frames with a hollow sound, like breath through ribs. Tyvek flapped at the corners. Bundled shingles sat untouched under tarps collecting dew. I walked the sandy path they had cut across the middle of the island and tried not to imagine families renting weekend units where mangroves used to open into quiet. Anger had carried me a long way, but that night what I mostly felt was grief. Not because I thought I would lose, by then I no longer did, but because seeing a place violated changes it. Even if every structure came down, I would always know how easily other people had treated inheritance as opportunity. At the Ridge House, I opened the old cedar chest where my grandfather kept papers too important to trust to memory. Most of the originals were already scanned and copied for court, but I wanted to hold them anyway. There was the deed, yellowed and brittle at the folds. There were survey notes in his handwriting. There was a photograph of him standing shirtless on the dock in 1978 beside a stringer of fish, grinning at the camera like a man who had chosen his life and meant to keep it. Tucked beneath the deed folder was something I had almost forgotten, a quiet title certification packet from 1981, prepared after a neighboring developer once challenged access rights to the surrounding shoals. My grandfather, suspicious of everyone with a project brochure, had gone beyond ordinary recording. He had obtained a court-certified affirmation of exclusive title boundaries, complete with embossed seal, judicial signature, and updated meets and bounds attachment. I stared at it for a long time under the kitchen light. Then I laughed. Not because it was funny, exactly, but because I suddenly understood what my grandfather had meant all those years when he told me to keep my papers better than my promises. Pelican Bay thought they were dragging me into court to argue over maps. They had no idea I was walking in with a piece of paper that had already answered the question 43 years ago. Courtrooms are designed to make everybody feel smaller than their certainty. The ceilings in ours were too high, the benches too hard, the air conditioning too cold by several calculated degrees. On the morning of the evidentiary hearing, Pelican Bay's board arrived in coordinated shades of coastal professionalism, navy blazers, cream blouses, expensive restraint. Their attorney set down 3 bankers' boxes at counsel table with the confidence of a man hoping volume might substitute for ownership. Kessler arrived carrying 1 trial bag, 2 binders, and the expression of someone coming to collect a debt. I sat behind him and watched the room fill. Alan Dorsey avoided my eyes. Denise kept reorganizing papers she clearly wasn't reading. Scott Vance whispered to the board's attorney so often it began to look like a nervous tick. A few residents had come too, drawn by rumor, resentment, or the primitive civic thrill of watching local power answer questions under oath. Marisol slipped into the back row 10 minutes before we began. She gave me the smallest nod, the kind people exchange when truth has been delayed but not defeated. Pelican Bay went first. Their attorney, a smooth man named Harwood who spoke in paragraphs polished for billing, opened by reframing the case as a complex boundary governance dispute arising from decades of layered planning activity. It was elegant nonsense, but expertly delivered. He talked about community reliance, development integration, administrative ambiguity, and equitable considerations tied to substantial construction already undertaken. He displayed the amended master plan on a monitor and walked the court through shaded parcels, access routes, amenity zones, and consultant notes as though title itself were a mood conveyed by color coordination. Then came witnesses. Alan Dorsey testified that the board had acted in good faith based on professional guidance and county acceptance of the amended plan. Under direct examination, he sounded almost convincing, concerned, diligent, civic-minded. But good faith has a short shelf life under cross-examination, especially when Kessler is the one asking the questions. "Mr. Dorsey," he said, before authorizing construction on Blackwater Key, "did you ever see a deed transferring title from Mr. Mercer or his family to Pelican Bay Estates?" Alan shifted in the witness chair. "I relied on the planning package and council review." "That's not my question. Did you see a deed?" "No." "Did you see an owner-signed consent form?" "I understood one existed within the filing process." "Did you see one?" "No." "Did you know county planning review does not itself adjudicate title?" "I believe the approvals were sufficient." Kessler paused just long enough for the judge to write that down. It was surgical. Every answer peeled away another layer of respectable confusion until what remained was a board president who had greenlit construction on private land because nobody had stopped him fast enough. Denise did no better. She admitted sending me dues notices before verifying any recorded annexation instrument. Scott Vance admitted the board considered delay financially undesirable once contractor deposits had been paid. The county planner confirmed again that exhibit shading on a master plan was not proof of ownership. By midday, Pelican Bay's theory had narrowed to a plea for equitable sympathy. They may have made mistakes, yes, but they had relied on process and invested heavily. Then Harwood called their final witness, the developer's planning consultant, a man named Raymond Seiler whose cufflinks cost more than my first skiff. He testified that Blackwater Key had been treated as part of the integrated coastal concept area during internal planning for years. He referenced owner coordination, legacy assumptions, and package completeness. But when Kessler pressed him about the missing consent forms, he became suddenly evasive. "Do you possess any signed document from Mr. Mercer conveying, annexing, or consenting Blackwater Key into Pelican Bay governance?" Kessler asked. "Not personally, no." "Have you ever seen such a document?" "I was informed one had been addressed." "By whom?" "Council and filing staff." "Name them." Harwood objected. The judge overruled. Seiler named two people. One was an in-house legal coordinator for the developer. The other had left the company 8 months earlier. Kessler did not look surprised. He simply thanked the witness and sat down. Then it was our turn. Kessler kept our opening brief. He walked the court through the chain of title, tax history, state permits, and contractor lien using my parcel number. He showed photos of the cabins rising on my land. He introduced the internal project emails with the phrase, "if owner pushes," highlighted in yellow. You could feel the room tightening as the implications settled over everyone. This had never been a real title belief. It had been a gamble. Finally, he called me. I testified to inheritance, ownership, the first HOA letter, the invoices, the objections, the construction, the shoreline mixer. My voice stayed steadier than I expected. Maybe anger had burned off enough to leave clarity behind. Maybe my grandfather's papers in the trial bag behind counsel table felt like ballast. When Harwood cross-examined me, he tried to paint me as territorial, emotional, resistant to community development. I let him. Then he asked whether I had brought anything beyond routine deed history to support exclusive title certainty. Kessler stood. "Yes, Your Honor," he said calmly. "As a matter of fact, we have one additional exhibit." He turned, reached into the binder, and lifted the old certification packet with its court seal intact. Across the room, for the first time all day, Pelican Bay's attorney stopped looking polished and started looking worried. There are few sounds in a courtroom more satisfying than paper changing the temperature of a room. Not a shout, not an objection, not even a ruling. Just paper, old, official, undeniable paper, set where everyone can see it. Kessler handed the certification packet to the clerk, who passed it to the judge. The embossed seal caught the overhead light for half a second, and I watched the board's attorney lean forward in the way men do when they hope distance will improve what they're reading. "Exhibit 42, Kessler said. "A court-certified quiet title affirmation entered in 1981 regarding Blackwater Key, including meets and bounds confirmation, judicial findings of exclusive title, and boundary clarification following a prior development-related access dispute." He let that sit there. If Pelican Bay had been building its case out of fog, this document was granite. It wasn't simply another deed in the chain or another survey attached to a tax parcel. It was a prior judicial determination, complete with findings, certification, and recorded boundary description that left almost no room for interpretive theater. My grandfather, suspicious and stubborn in equal measure, had already gone to court decades earlier and obtained exactly the kind of ruling that people like Alan Dorsey assume no ordinary landowner will have the foresight to secure. The judge read silently for longer than anyone on the Pelican Bay side seemed comfortable with. Harwood asked to inspect the exhibit more closely. His voice remained professional, but the polish had cracked around the edges. Kessler agreed, with the serene generosity of a man holding a winning lottery ticket at the tax counter. Harwood flipped through the packet, stopped at the judicial findings, then at the recording stamp, then at the attached survey coordinates. He conferred with Alan in a hurried whisper. Alan's face drained by stages, as if someone were lowering the tide from behind his eyes. Kessler resumed his questioning of me only long enough to authenticate how the packet had remained in family records and how copies had been compared against the recorded archive. Then he rested. Harwood stood for cross on the exhibit, but there was almost nowhere left for him to go. He suggested the 1981 certification addressed a narrower dispute about adjacent shoal access. Kessler responded by directing the court to the attached findings, which explicitly affirmed exclusive title to Blackwater Key within the very boundaries Pelican Bay now claimed as community property. Harwood implied that later planning developments might have altered governance realities. The judge, to her credit, cut through that quickly. "Counsel," she said, "planning status is not self-effectuating as to title." That line landed like a hammer. By then, even the residents in the gallery understood what they were watching. This was no longer a complicated land use disagreement between sophisticated parties. It was a board that had treated paperwork like camouflage and run straight into an older, stronger piece of paperwork that had been waiting quietly in a cedar chest since the Reagan administration. Kessler's closing was short, which is what strong cases become when they stop needing decoration. He laid it out plainly. Uninterrupted title in the Mercer family since 1974. Judicial reaffirmation in 1981, no deed transfer, no signed consent, no annexation instrument, no lawful HOA jurisdiction, internal communications acknowledging an owner while proceeding anyway, construction undertaken despite objections, and continuing trespass causing irreparable harm. He asked for immediate injunctive relief, declaratory confirmation of exclusive ownership, removal authority for all unauthorized structures at defendant's expense, and sanctions to be considered after supplemental briefing. Harwood tried to salvage equity from the wreckage. He argued reliance, administrative confusion, and the practical burden of dismantling partially completed cabins. He suggested everyone had acted under a sincere misunderstanding generated by planning complexity. It might have worked a little better if his own client's emails had not included instructions to stay on schedule if the owner pushed. When the judge finally spoke, the room stilled in a way that felt almost physical. She found that the record overwhelmingly supported my exclusive ownership of Blackwater Key. She found no evidence of any conveyance, annexation, or consent sufficient to bring the island within Pelican Bay governance. She found that the amended planning documents did not and could not transfer title. She found that defendants had proceeded with construction despite glaring deficiencies in ownership verification and despite direct notice of my objections. Then she granted the injunction. All work was to cease immediately. No occupancy, no marketing, no further improvements, no resident access. Within 10 days, defendants were to submit a jointly funded remediation and removal plan, subject to court approval, addressing every unauthorized structure, pathway, utility marking, and site disturbance. I heard someone in the gallery whisper, "Oh my God." But the part one remember most came next. The judge adjusted her glasses, looked directly at Harwood, then at the board behind him, and said, "If there are missing owner consent forms in any filing stream connected to this matter, parties should consider their preservation obligations very seriously." It was not an accusation. Judges are usually too disciplined for that. It was worse. It was an invitation to imagine future trouble. Outside the courtroom, the board tried to leave quickly. Residents intercepted them before they reached the parking lot. Questions rose in sharp, angry bursts. "Did you know? How much did this cost us? Were the cabins ever legal? Alan kept saying the association would review options. Denise said they had acted in good faith. Scott said no further comment. Their words scattered in the hot air like ash. Kessler stood beside me on the courthouse steps and watched the chaos with professional restraint. So, he said, you did, in fact, pull out the deed in court. I looked at the trial bag in his hand and thought of my grandfather's cedar chest, the old seal, the years of silence inside paper. Not the deed, I said. The better paper. Winning in court does not feel as triumphant as people imagine. There is no orchestra swell, no perfect burst of vindication washing everything clean. What you get instead is paperwork, deadlines, and the peculiar exhaustion that follows after months of being told reality is negotiable. I went back to Blackwater Key the morning after the injunction with a copy of the order in a waterproof folder and found the island quieter than it had been in weeks. No generators, no nail guns, no crews unloading from barges. Wind moved through pine branches and unfinished rafters, and for the first time since construction began, the place sounded like itself trying to return. Still, the cabins remained, 26 of them in various stages of completion, standing there like evidence with roofs. Some were just frames and wrapped sheathing. Others had windows installed, doors stacked nearby, porch posts already trimmed. The bathhouse site remained only paint marks in the sand and a rectangle of disturbed soil, which somehow offended me less than the cabins did. Maybe because a plan still unrealized feels reversible in a way construction never does. The court's 10-day deadline ignited a secondary war. Pelican Bay, its insurers, the developer, the general contractor, and a flock of subcontractors all suddenly discovered new opinions about responsibility. Kessler copied me on enough correspondence to make one thing clear. Nobody wanted to be the last entity touching those structures. The board wanted the developer to fund removal. The developer wanted the contractor to absorb part of the cost under representations tied to site control. The contractor pointed to the owner information supplied in bid materials. The insurers reserved rights in every direction. Meanwhile, the court order sat over all of them like weather. By day 6, a proposed remediation plan reached Kessler's office. It was 32 pages long, overly formatted, and written in the strained language of people trying not to admit they are lucky to be negotiating terms instead of sanctions. The cabins would be dismantled in phases under environmental oversight. Materials deemed reusable would be removed by barge and stored off-site. Utility markings would be remediated. Soil disruption near the cistern would be restored. Temporary access cuts through the undergrowth would be replanted with native species under a coastal ecologist's supervision. The board wanted, of course, a clause stating the work was not an admission of intentional wrongdoing. Kessler crossed that line out so hard his pen nearly tore the paper. The judge approved a revised version 3 days later. Removal started the following Monday. I expected satisfaction. What I got was something more complicated. Watching men take apart the cabins board by board did not erase the fact that they had been built. It felt less like revenge than surgery. Necessary, unpleasant, and expensive in ways no one involved would fully admit. Vince was still the site's supervisor, though the mirrored sunglasses had disappeared, along with most of his swagger. He carried a clipboard and looked perpetually braced for criticism. One afternoon he approached while I was photographing the first cabin being stripped down. For what it's worth, he said, not quite meeting my eyes. I should have asked more questions. It was not an apology exactly, but it was close enough to register. You build what's in front of you, I said. Yeah, he replied. That's the problem sometimes. The residents of Pelican Bay remained in varying stages of outrage. Some blamed the board for recklessness. Some blamed the developer for aggressive expansion. A few still blamed me, because there are always people who resent the person who ruins a convenient lie. But the board's authority had been punctured beyond repair. Emergency meetings were held. A forensic accounting review was commissioned. Residents circulated petitions demanding resignations. Nancy Heller, the retired orthodontist who started the public questioning, became an accidental folk hero in the neighborhood. Somebody printed T-shirts for a protest outside the clubhouse that read "Ask for the deed." Then came the resignations. Scott Vance went first, citing family reasons. Denise followed with a statement about protecting the community from distraction. Alan Dorsey held out the longest, releasing a letter full of phrases like unintended consequences and sincere reliance. But he resigned before the month was over when residents demanded access to legal invoices and project authorizations. The developer publicly distanced itself from association-level decisions, which was laughable to anyone who had seen the subcontractor emails. Kessler, who considered understatement a recreational activity, described the whole unraveling as administratively energetic. As for the missing consent forms, that story didn't die. The judge's warning had done exactly what warnings like that are meant to do. It made everyone suddenly care about document preservation. There were supplemental subpoenas, records requests, and nervous exchanges among people who had once assumed no one would look too closely. I can't say more about that part because some threads were still moving through lawyers and carriers and one very interested state investigator. But I can say this much. Papers that exist matter, and papers that are said to exist matter even more when they don't. By the time the last cabin frame came down, the island looked bruised but recognizable. Open sky returned where pitched roofs had interrupted it. The path to the ridge softened under fresh sand and replanted scrub. The water at sunset caught its old bronze color again. I stood on the dock that evening and thought about how close lies can come to permanence when they arrive with permits, consultants, and polite cover letters. Then I thought about my grandfather, his cedar chest, his suspicion, his patience. People like Alan Dorsey believe ownership is mostly a matter of confidence. But confidence is temporary. Paper endures. By the end of the second month, Blackwater Key had entered that strange stage of recovery where damage is still visible if you know where to look, but strangers would call it peace. The cabins were gone. The bathhouse never existed beyond scraped sand and arrogance. The walking paths had been broken up, replanted, and left under erosion netting like wounds held shut with mesh. Along the western shoreline, where barges once shoved their noses into the shallows, sea oats had begun reclaiming the torn edges. Nature is not sentimental, but it is patient, and patience can look a lot like correction. The legal aftermath kept moving long after the hammers stopped. Pelican Bay's insurance carrier funded part of the removal under reservation, then turned around and started carving pieces of blame out of everyone else. The general contractor pursued indemnity from the developer. The developer hinted that certain board members had exceeded legal advice. Residents demanded a special meeting and voted in a temporary oversight committee with all the enthusiasm of people discovering the brochure life comes with footnotes. Kessler spent those weeks answering motions, objecting to creative interpretations of the injunction, and negotiating the sort of reimbursement language that only lawyers can discuss for hours without visible injury. I mostly stayed on the island. People assumed I would sell after all that. A local broker even left me a handwritten note saying, in effect, that market scarcity plus recent visibility made this an ideal time to capitalize. I burned the note in the sink and used the ash to start a grill fire. Some places stop being property in the ordinary sense. They become continuity. Blackwater Key was where my grandfather taught me tide charts, engine repair, and the difference between weather coming from the east and weather pretending not to. It was where my mother scattered his ashes. It was where every family story I care about seems to lead eventually, like runoff finding low ground. You don't capitalize that. You protect it. One Saturday morning, Marisol came out by skiff with a paper bag full of Cuban sandwiches and a county records printout she insisted I would appreciate. We ate on the dock in the heat while gulls argued overhead. "What am I looking at?" I asked after unfolding the printout. She smiled. They corrected the digital archive index. At first I didn't understand. Then I saw it. The amended Pelican Bay master filing now carried an internal notation flagging ownership inconsistency and referencing the court's order. Under related parcel annotations, Blackwater Key was listed plainly as separate privately owned land outside HOA governance, with a cross-reference to the 1981 Quiet Title Certification. In other words, she said, taking a bite of her sandwich, future idiots will have to work harder. I laughed hard enough to scare a heron off the shallows. There were other small satisfactions too. The residents' lawsuit against the former board survived its initial procedural challenge. Nancy Heller was elected to the new compliance committee, which felt poetically disproportionate in the best possible way. Someone from Pelican Bay anonymously mailed me one of the protest t-shirts, asked for the deed, along with a note that read, "For what it's worth, some of us are glad you didn't let them get away with it." I hung the shirt in the tool shed, where my grandfather would have appreciated the joke. Not every ending arrives with total closure. The questions about the missing consent forms never resolved into a neat public confession. Document trails frayed. Memories blurred. Consultants blamed turnover. Filing staff blamed incomplete transmittals. Lawyers used phrases like "to the best of my recollection" until language itself began sounding like insulation. Maybe someone fabricated an expectation. Maybe someone implied documents existed because admitting they did not would have stalled a profitable plan. Maybe the whole machine simply ran on collective cowardice, which is often more than enough. The law does not always excavate motive to bedrock. Sometimes it only proves where the shovel struck. Still, one final scene stays with me. About 3 months after the hearing, I had to go to the mainland marina for fuel filters and paint thinner. As I came back down the dock, I saw Alan Dorsey standing near the bait freezer with a cardboard box under one arm. No blazer, no bored confidence, just a man in a faded polo, waiting for someone to load supplies into a pickup. He saw me and froze in that awkward, involuntary way people do when their private version of events has already been publicly destroyed. For a second I considered walking past him without a word. But curiosity is a stronger instinct than grace in me. "How much did it cost you?" I asked. He looked genuinely confused. "What?" "The island," I said. "How much did trying to take it cost?" His jaw tightened. "More than it was worth." I nodded. That's usually how theft works when the owner keeps his papers. Then I kept walking. Back on Blackwater Key that evening, I opened the cedar chest one more time and returned the quiet title packet to its place beneath the deed. The paper was older, softer now at the edges, but still solid. Outside, the tide turned against the dock pilings with its usual patient knock. There are people who think power lives in boards, budgets, signatures, committees, polished presentations, all the loud machinery of modern certainty. Maybe sometimes it does. But when the noise burns off, what remains are facts that can survive silence. My grandfather understood that. Now I do too.